In 2023, is sex redeemable? Have we so distorted and degraded the biblical notion of sex through the pill and pornography that good, clean sex between, like married people is a lost cause? In this, the second episode of our season on all things sex, we speak with married Catholic priest and researcher, Dr. Paul Sullins. We look at the biblical case for sex and whether the sexual revolution has been a net win or a net loss. What the limits are to biblical sex, and beyond opinions or interpretation, what the data tells us about our new ideas around sex. Yes, we'll actually try to tackle all of that in about an hour on today's Theology on Air. Well, thanks for listening to Theology on Air. I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor here at First Lutheran in Houston. I'm joined by Sarah Stone, Director of Community and Evangelistic Outreach at Memorial Drive Presbyterian Church. You can learn more about Houston Theology on Tap. Of course, Theology on Air is an outgrowth of Theology on Tap here in Houston. And you can learn more about us at houstontot.com, learn about our leadership team, what churches we serve, where to find us, where to learn more. Of course, we want you to like this, review it, say happy things about us on the internet, and drive more people to this content. As you know, we've changed our format recently to one of seasons where we're trying to do more exhaustive looks at topical issues. This is our season on all things sex. And to make sure we don't just talk about, the controversial issues. Wait, they're all controversial,
yes.
Aren't they? Yeah.
Well, they're all spicy at least.
Yeah. We want to take some time to lay the groundwork for what the Bible says about sex. And you might be surprised to learn that, for example, heterosexuals can sin too. But today we're joined by Dr. Paul Sullins. The Reverend Dr. Paul Sullins is a senior research associate at the Ruth Institute, which is how I heard of him. He recently retired as professor of sociology at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. He's a leader in the field of research on same-sex parenting and its implications for child development. He's written 4 books and over 100 journal articles, research reports, and essays on issues of family, faith, and culture. His reports on clerical sexual abuse from the Pennsylvania grand jury data, John Jay data, Los Angeles Times, and other sources have garnered international acclaim. Formerly Episcopalian, Dr. Sullins is a married Catholic priest. So for all of you out there who are saying a Catholic priest can't know anything about the topic that we're talking about, well, he is married. So there. He earned a PhD at Catholic University in 1997, taught there from 1998 until his retirement. He and his wife, Patricia, have an interracial family of 3 children, 2 adopted. He serves as associate pastor of the Church of St. Mark the Evangelist in Hyattsville, Maryland. So, Dr. Sullins, thank you so much for joining us. Maybe give us a quick introduction, how you got into this kind of line of work. Obviously controversial. What interests you about it? And then we'll kind of start to drill down from there.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be with you today. When I retired from Catholic University, I taught sociology there for a long time, sociology of religion. And I did some studies on gender and religion, which got me in the beginning of this topic. But it really took off when I retired, and I started looking at same-sex marriage and the issues leading up to the 2015 decision in Obergefell. I studied children who were with same-sex parents. And I found that the narrative that we were being told was the opposite of the truth, that there were significant problems that could be seen in the population data for these children, and also were being reported by adults who had grown up with same-sex parents, and it was being suppressed. But that got me into the issue of homosexuality. And as you mentioned, I've done some reports on clergy homosexuality in the Catholic Church, which is a very conflicted issue, certainly among Catholics. And that led to kind of getting into the whole gender war, gender ideology business, and looking at a lot of these issues. What I've come to understand is that the so-called sexual revolution really primed and prompted almost all of these issues that we're facing today. both on a personal level and on a social level. We have been led down a false path,
Mm.
prompted by, and this may be controversial for you, but beginning with, I think, removal of restrictions on contraception,
Mhm.
then widespread divorce, no-fault divorce, that have broken families up, furthered by widely available abortion without restrictions, which creates the illusion that you can separate sex relations from
Mhm.
children and from the procreation of children. And once that happens, it opens the door to lots of difficulties in understanding anything about sex. Sex is our means for reproducing our species, but if we deny that that's happening, then we're faced with all kinds of difficulties on how we should place sex, what should be the place of it in our lives, what are men and women for, and that leads us today to even talking about what are men and women. We're not even sure what those are anymore. So we've kind of forgotten what it means to be male, female, and significantly, we've forgotten that is a large part of the image of God in our
Mhm.
in our lives. So you could say that we've forgotten God, and so we've forgotten who we are sexually, or it could be the other way around. But that's kind of a story of how I got drawn into these things more and more. Lately, I've been looking at mostly at bans on conversion therapy for persons who are in an LGBT identity of some sort and want to leave that, or they may want to leave just the behavior and not try to leave the attractions, or they may want to try to leave the attractions, or they want to usually do that because they want to live in accord with their religious beliefs, with their faith conviction, or because they want to pursue a positive relationship in marriage with someone of the opposite sex. And so, as you may know, there are many efforts to ban or make not possible those kinds of therapies. So my latest research shows that persons who undergo that kind of therapy are not harmed by it. In fact, it reduces their suicidality by about 100%. About half suicidality. Again, it's a false narrative that's being put forth that tries to show the opposite to be true.
Yeah.
But that's all just part of the almost willful denial of what sex is and what
Yeah.
sex is for in our day.
Well, I remember a few years ago, there was an article in First Things. I believe the author was a female, but I don't remember who it was. But she made a pretty convincing case of this kind of slippery slope, if you will, beginning with the birth control pill, but really a contraceptive mentality that led to all the things you just said. No fault divorce, abortion.
Right.
And now we're at the point where we don't even know what gender is, and some of us think that's okay, and some of us think that's kind of a problem. But we've already recorded it, and it'll come out later in the podcast series. We're going to look at the transgender issue as well. We've interviewed Nancy Piercy for that. I don't know if you're familiar with her and her work on that, but I think there'd be a lot of agreement there. But let's kind of try to go back a little bit, kind of set the stage.
Okay.
Give us a brief overview of the biblical case for sex. This is Theology on Tap. We are all Christians here. So what purpose does sex serve? What are some biblical texts that we might look to for that? I know we could do the whole thing just on those questions, but maybe kind of an overview of the Bible and sex. What does it have to say on the topic?
Okay. Well, of course, in the beginning, we should say, God created the human race without sex. There was just one kind of person, and as you know, the biblical story, there was an attempt to satisfy the needs of the man through the created order, which was not successful. And so sex is God's provision in the biblical account of companionship for the man. And that's companionship in a kind of ontological sense. So that when the woman was created, she was recognized by the man as an alternate identity that he could relate to. Bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. And so the creation of sexes brought man out of isolation into relationality. Now, I believe that we find also our identity in our relations, in relationality. And so, in a way, it helped man to understand who he was.
I
The
like that.
the scriptures tell us next that male and female, the creation of man, male and female, was a reflection of the image of God. You may know that verse. I'm not sure I can quote it exactly, but it says, God created man in his image, male and female, he created them. And what that, I believe, tells us is that we reflect the character of God when we relate as male and female. There's something profound about that relationship that is divine.
So let me just stop you, because that's, I think, a really important point. But would you say that it's not that a man or a woman is made in the image of God, meaning that, for example, they have personality, or they have knowledge of morality, or they have a spiritual side or something? I mean, a lot of people have tried to figure out what is the image of God, but you're saying it's the kind of male and female together that, it could be all those things too, but you need the two things together to understand the fullness of the image of God.
Yeah, the classic description would be rationality.
Okay.
That the human reason reflects the image of God. That's in the sort of a Thomistic tradition and Aristotelian. But those are very individualistic concepts of the human person, right? A unified being in and of itself is how they each conceived of us. And what we I think are beginning to understand today that we have to think of human personhood as also being reflected in the relation of male and female. That this is an important dynamic for human life because God created us that way. Now, St. Paul tells us that the conjugal act of husband and wife is a reflection of the relationship between Christ and the church, which I think is a more focused or specific way of expounding that idea from Genesis, that we reflect the character of God in our relationship as man and woman. Now, it's not just mere sexuality. It's not just a physical act of sex. It is sexuality expressed in the fullness of a relationship between a man and a woman, which we typically understand as being the characteristics of marriage. And so a man and a woman who commit an act of matrimony, let's call it, with one another. Now, in the Catholic world, that's defined very specifically. It has to be an act of such a nature as to produce new life. It has to be a procreative act, which in a way limits the range of possible acts that could occur there. And it limits the possible participants in such an act. You have to have two people who, if they engage in such an act, have a possibility of procreating. And so when two people do that in the context of marriage, they reflect in a profound and unique way the character of God himself. You think, now we know of God that he's three persons in one. And those persons we understand from analogy with family. We say it's Father and Son, and then the Holy Spirit. And if you think of the relation of male and female in a marriage, you have the husband and the wife, and from that you have coming new life. So as the Father relates to the Son and the Holy Spirit is new life in that, or is the love that is reflected there, you have a man and a woman expressing themselves, and a new human being, which is an expression of the love between those two. So you have this kind of dynamism that's reflected in those kind of relations.
So I want to come back to some of those kind of issues a little bit more, and if you will, flesh them out just a little more, because so we're going to come back to that. But keying in on this kind of idea of the male, female, the bearing of children, that being at least a primary reason in the Bible for sex. I mean, be fruitful and multiply. We'll talk about maybe some of the other reasons for sex or benefits or not, but what are kind of some of the benefits of a specifically male and female lifelong union? And the reason that I ask, of course, is because a major issue in our culture, a question for our culture today is, well, really any two people or any four people.
Throuple.
We've got polygamy and polyamory are on the rise, and you've got anyway. Are there benefits? I mean, the Bible says there are benefits, but does any data bear out that there actually are benefits to the limiting of a lifelong male female couple and then the fruit that they produce?
Okay, all right. Well, I want to answer your question. I think you want not a biblical answer to that question, but you want to know from the evidence and the data.
Well, I'm happy with both too. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to give you a secular answer to that question, but one of the things that I want to just tie off in our Christian understanding of sex, the main idea is that for Christians, sex is a sacred thing. It is elevated. Now, a lot of times people, when they're in a sexual relationship, they'll talk it in this kind of language, and they'll say, wow, this is just really divine. This is amazing. And
otherworldly.
Oh God, this is wonderful. And that sense of transcendence in our sexuality is something that I think is brought to us by our faith. In fact, sociologists have studied persons in different kind of understandings of their sex relationships, and a famous description of this by the sociologist whose name I don't remember at the moment, it'll come to me, talked about the pure relationship, which is where two people without any context or expectations enter into this kind of sexual relationship without any kind of strings attached, right? And that's the model or the image of the ideal of a sexual relationship in most sociological secular understanding today, is that you don't have the restrictions of gender roles, of heteronormativity, of all of these expectations, but you can just enter into it without any limitations. But one of the things they've discovered is that people who attempt to do that lose the sense of transcendence in their sexual relations. It becomes perfunctory. It becomes something that's just for pleasure only, and it kind of demeans the experience, even to those who are participating in it and even advocating it. They recognize that you're going to lose a sense of transcendence and meaning in that kind of sexual
So
relationship.
there's kind of a trade-off where it's like now sex is everywhere, but no one likes it anymore. You know, it seems
That's
like
right.
it's everywhere, but people don't have it as much, or it's everywhere, but it's joyless. You know, it's like obligatory. We have to shake our behind, you know, at a you know, on a video or, you know, a music video or something. But I don't, you know what I mean? It just feels,
Yes.
it seems joyless to me, but what do I know? You know, I'm a crank. So
Yes. No, you're absolutely right. Um, and data has also shown that young people today are having less sex. There's less
Uh-huh.
interest. And so, you know, to age 35, both men and women today are engaged in less amount of time in their lives that they're in sexual relationships. Um, and so we've lost hold of um, kind of something important about sex. Now, let me get to your second question, because this is a good one. What are some of the kind of practical secular reasons for sex and for marriage? Well, we have to begin by recognizing that almost every human culture that we know of has something that we would recognize as marriage. They have developed an institution that regularizes sex relations. And amazingly, these forms of marriages are far more similar than they are different. And so, one of the first things that marriage brings in almost every culture is sexual exclusivity. There's a presumption, if not a strong commitment and strong sanctions on that man and that woman having sex only with each other and not with anyone else. Now, the reason that that developed reveals to us one of the most important reasons of marriage, and that is it keeps us alive. The fidelity or sexual exclusivity that's expressed in marriage is a great protection against communicated diseases, particularly in cultures in world history before the discovery of antibiotics. Couples who were not faithful to one another would open themselves up to sexually transmitted diseases and other communicable diseases, and would not tend to survive. And in fact, the anthropologists speculate that there may have been a number of cultures that did not develop strong norms of sexual exclusivity and didn't survive as a result. They were wiped out by disease. Now, we've seen a great pandemic disease in our global society in the past 3 or 4 years, excuse me, that has surprised us with its virulence, even in the face of all of the modern medicine that we have. And we found that the only way that we could control it was through what? Isolation, staying apart with your own family unit and not going out with others. And so a lot of people learned how to stay home. That was the primary mode of protection against this emergent disease. That's true, been true for a long time. And so one of the primary reasons for marriage, as we understand it, is for public health, to keep us from transmitting diseases. Another reason is that men and women, I want to say this the right way, it is that sex tends to produce children. And a child can present a set of problems, certainly a set of stresses for a married couple, for a couple that's in a sexual relation, because women are, unlike many other species, human women are fertile all the time, or at least they're periodically fertile, certain days of a month, continually. It's not as if they have 1 or 2 times a year that they're fertile, and they advertise that, and they're only open to sex relations during those times of the year and not any time else. That's the way it is with most higher mammal species, but not ours. So what happens for humans is that a man who has sex with a woman and then she gets pregnant never knows for sure that it's his child that she's carrying. He needs some assurance of that fact. The woman never knows for sure if that man is going to stick around and help her raise the child. And so marriage addresses both of those difficulties for men and for women. The second most important social reason for marriage is the identification of offspring. And into the modern era, that was a explicit difficulty or dynamic for marriages, backed up by law and tradition and custom, so that we had longstanding traditions of legitimate children and illegitimate children. The purpose of marriage was to ensure that your child would be legitimate. But we recognize that not all children were, even today, not all children are.
Yeah.
And so marriage helps to define what are the children that are going to, and this would be the third social benefit of marriage, I believe. It is the transmission of inheritance. So it defines who the children are that are going to receive the benefits, the resources of that couple, so that they can be raised and they can flourish. And then when that couple passes on, they're going to inherit and maybe carry on some of the goals and ideals of that couple, maybe not, but they're going to reap those resources and carry those forward into a new generation. One of the ways that a family is like God is that it exists in all times at once. The family is the only social institution in which you have the past, the present, and the future all together. You have the generation that's being generated to come, and it's going to outlive everyone else. And then you have the father and the mother, the middle progenitors, and then you have the older generation that is traditionally has been cared for by the family. So you have this cycle of what I call intergenerational solidarity that kind of rolls through time, creating love and care and acceptance for all of its participants over time. Now, in our day, a lot of that has been co-opted by the government. We have Social Security for old age, so we say, well, we don't have to involve the elderly as much. But you know what? I'm getting to be elderly, and I have to tell you, Social Security in isolation doesn't do it for almost all of us. It's the children still are important and need to support you, and they need us too in many ways. And the government, of course, would like to take over child care, beginning, I think, with birth. They'd just like us to deliver the kid to them at the hospital, and they can raise them how they want. And yet we're finding out that nothing beats a family, not only for the first few months of life when the mother is absolutely essential to a child's well-being, to later years when the father becomes extremely important, but also for education. I don't think that any, excuse me, in general, I don't think that any school system in America could beat strong, effective homeschooling with committed parents. So I think we're finding that this institution that we've known for a long time, we believe was established by God, is pre-governmental. It's the basic institution of human life. I think we're finding once again in our day that institution is a whole lot more important than any government replacements of it.
Yeah. Let me ask you this.
Otherwise, I'll just motor on, please.
No. I love the anthropological piece of it. And I even thought when you were talking about, that marriage was part of the benefit of it is eliminating disease, right? And right. I thought, man, we've come up with answers to a lot of those diseases now, but having sex outside of marriage presents almost like a new kind of disease now. It's not necessarily like syphilis or something, but might be ideological, philosophical, heartbreak, all kinds of things. But I want to ask, Christians have sort of been the like perennial buzzkills when it comes to questions of sex. We're always thought as being uptight because we're constantly saying no to lots of different kinds of sex, premarital sex, homosexual sex, the wrong kinds of sex,
Right.
So give us some hope here. Once married, and I am not yet married, so give me some future hope here. Is there any data to indicate that, married Christians actually like sex? Is there fun happening in the bedroom?
Yeah. There's a lot of data that faith married couples, I don't know if I would say Christian necessarily, but couples that are in a lifelong marriage and also worship together have the happiest, most satisfying sex life by far. On almost every survey that looks at these questions, having sex with one person for your whole life does something to energize and to make that a very profound experience. I mentioned earlier, by the way, I remember the name is Anthony Giddens, the British sociologist. The book is called The Transformation of Intimacy. And that's the one that talks about the so-called pure relationship, but also about the loss of transcendence, and in some ways the loss of real meaning in a sexual relationship outside of a religious context. And that is one of the great benefits of marriage, and of marriage in a sacred form, is that people find a real connection with God in their sexual relationship. It doesn't happen when you're breaking the rules, when you're just going out for fun and for pleasure. You have to understand that the challenge of marriage, even sexually, is that you're laying down your life for another person. You're committing yourself to a person. If you think about it, if you have two people and they're both seeking as much pleasure as they can get, that's one kind of sex.
Yeah.
But what if you have two people and each of them are seeking for the other person to get the most pleasure they can get? When the wife is saying, well, I don't know if I'm going to get everything I want, but I want to please him above all. And the husband is saying, I don't know if I'm going to get what I want, but I want to please her above all. And you have two people who are outdoing one another.
Yeah, there's a Bible verse about that.
know?
Maybe it wasn't intended about sex, but it applies.
Yeah. And I tell you, you can't beat that for sex because men and women are really different. And if they're each going after their own thing, somebody's going to be disappointed. Someone might have a 9 or 10 on the scale, but the other person might only have a 1 or 2, you know. And they even might trade off. So you get yours this time, I'll get mine next time. I mean, you can do all those kind of tricks, but if you have two people who are not transacting business, but are giving gifts, who are genuinely laying down their lives for one another, which is what Christ calls us to do in our whole lives, but particularly in our marriages. Wow. It sounds like, I'm having sacrificial sex. I guess I'm just giving, for the other person. It turns out just the opposite.
Right. Well, that's true in so many ways, even outside of sex, right? When you sacrifice for someone else, you end up getting such a return.
And it's not to say that there aren't many, Christian marriages where, like bad things are happening, right? Like there are people who are doing it all wrong. So we're not, we don't want to paint this idealistic picture. I mean, there are churches that, seem to tolerate abuse, in marriages and things like that, so we understand that we're kind of having to speak holistically, but talk about and it also just seems obvious that if you're married to someone, you're, unless you're in the proverbial doghouse, you're going to end up in the same bed with someone night after night after night after night. It's not a constant question of, will tonight, will I get lucky tonight? I mean, we even call it that. Will I get lucky tonight? It's like, you don't really, those aren't really words that apply in a marriage. You know, you don't have to get lucky. You've made the commitment, and now you get to, you know, you reap
That's
the
right.
reward, if you will.
Mm.
So, but if you're
But-
constantly on the prowl, you have to hope to get lucky, or maybe the line will work on the right woman tonight, but maybe it won't the next week or
Mm.
something.
Well, and
Anyway.
so in a marriage, you know, sex becomes regularized. And I know this may sound unromantic, but a lot of couples at some point in their marriage, they say, you know, let's have this night be our night for intimacy. They either fall into a pattern or they
Make
intentionally
one. Yeah.
pattern. That creates lots of good things about sex. You don't have to play this game. Well, I'm going to get lucky or whatever. You know, you can plan for it. You can build some good things around it. And I encourage couples to do that, to don't just expect sex to happen spontaneously in your marriage. This is an important part of your ministry to one another and your gifts to one another. So you want to make that special.
Have one more thing I want to just throw out while we're on this topic. I was supposed to punt it over back to Evan, but you hear people all the time say, especially younger generations say, well, you know, humans were never meant to be monogamous. Especially they'll say it about men. Men are never meant to be monogamous. It's not like our de facto way of being. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Go back to Genesis. God created Eve and presented him to Adam. And what was Adam's immediate response? Wow, this is different. This is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And what's amazing there is that it is as if God created Eve and established them nuptially. I mean, there's no place in there where they got married. There's no place where they were apart and then they had courtship and they got married. No, she came, and so her natural first normal way of relating to this man was in marriage, was in a sexual relationship.
Mhm.
That's the basic normal way for human beings to relate. The idea that people are non-monogamous, it is an effect, I think, of the fall. It is a defection from
Mhm.
God's ideal and God's plan for our lives.
Yeah.
So you would say, if people say we weren't created to be this way, you'd say, well, actually, if you want to know how we were created, you have to go to Genesis 1 and 2.
Yeah.
Genesis 3 is a perversion of the creation. So
we were absolutely created to be this way. That is to be, if you like it, monogamous.
yeah.
And that is our highest and best way to live. Even Jesus himself affirmed that for us. It doesn't mean that everyone has to get married. You know, it's a mystery and a profound thing that the one who created sex when he became human never engaged in it himself.
Mhm.
That there are higher ends to life. There are ways that sex can lead us to God by abstaining from it as well. But the idea that we are supposed to have sex with other people, a number of people, just it is completely untrue. This idea that, well, we have to try it out, you know, it's like driving a car. We got to try it out, see if it's going to work before we want to make a commitment to it. You know, that cheapens and commodifies human life so revoltingly. That you and I are created for a relationship with God. Does that mean we're supposed to try all other gods or other philosophies until we find out true God? And somehow that's ridiculous. We're created with a heart for the one true God, and we find that great fulfillment in there.
I like that metaphor. That's
the same way with our relationship with the man or the woman that God has called us to be with. We find that person, we are joined to that person, and it's for life.
yeah.
So let me
go ahead.
let me jump in. I mean,
Sure,
you're kind of answering the question, but what really are, we've had the sexual revolution or whatever you want to call it since whenever you want to say it started, the 1960s, or arguably before that, as we talked about with maybe the advent of the pill a little bit before that. But what kind of have been the results, right? I mean, we've had a long enough data pool here, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, whatever the case may be, to kind of say, all right, well, we've tried it your way. Where we've got the hookup culture going on these days. We've got, we've got no fault divorce. We've got, people, we got dating apps. We've kind of had it all, right? Free love in the 60s.
The convenience of sex. Yeah.
So you mentioned the spread of disease earlier, and I think something like 100 million Americans have, we used to call them STDs. I don't know what they're called anymore.
STIs.
Yeah, there you go. So, so clearly that's got to be a result. I mean, I don't think if we waited until marriage to have sex and only had sex with one person, we would have 100 million Americans with STIs. The other thing you mentioned was the degrading of the person. How did you say that? The commodification of sex.
Yeah.
I know Jennifer like Morse talks a lot about that at Ruth Institute. So I know you guys use a lot of the same language, but what are some of the other effects of the sexual revolution?
Well, you have 40 million children killed before birth.
At least
due to abortion. Direct result in my mind of the sexual revolution. You have millions of men and women whose lives have been torn apart by divorce. You have millions more children who have grown up in those broken homes and families, have difficulty trusting persons as adults and entering into relationships with themselves. You have single mothers as a result. The highest predictor of poverty in America is to be a single mother. We have untold social problems that come as a result of children who grow up without a father. Not having a father is the highest predictor of delinquency, criminality throughout life. We also have a culture in which men and women have trouble trusting each other, connecting with one another. Today, we have the cultural degradation of male-female relationships before marriage, to where it's almost impossible to figure out how to find someone to marry, how to have a positive kind of dating relationship. Young people I know search for this and have trouble finding anything above kind of a cheap sort of hookup bar scene kind of connection. So we have cheapened kind of our whole culture around these issues.
Yeah.
If it is the case that women, generally speaking, want to give sex in order to get love, and men want to give love in order to get sex. I know that's oversimplification, but there's a lot of truth to it, right?
There is.
What has happened today is that the value of sex has become so cheap. It's so easy and so common that women have to give more and more sex to get less and less love, and they end up used and broken and alone. Men feel like
it's like sex inflation,
Yeah,
it's worth less. Yeah.
Well, and it's not just more and more, but it's also more and more deviant, different, new and creative and crazy, and
right. So it has mined womanhood in a very real and profound way, and in turn that has undermined manhood, because men are not called to step up and become a real man in many ways.
Sarah and I were just talking about it was a kind of phenomenon podcast a while back, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It's about Mark Driscoll and all of that. But one of the reasons that he kind of came to prominence was his call to men to be responsible men, to give up pornography, to give up the hookup culture, to get married young, to have children. I mean, it was an appropriate message for our time and a resonant message. It's kind of the tragic hero thing. The thing that kind of made him work also kind of led to the downfall of that church, but that's a whole other story. But
well, and Jordan Peterson does the same thing and then gets called a misogynist and all these things. Yeah.
But and there's a book that's going to be referenced or an author, it's going to be referenced in the talk we did with Nancy Piercy about a woman, and she's a British woman, and you could probably Google some of these words and find the article. I know the Daily Mail, I think, did a kind of subset or a snippet of her book that's about to be published, but she basically talks about a decade of Tinder and how it's left, and how men are, especially handsome men, are the more they're so valuable that a lot of women will, do anything to try to end up with them, to try to end up marrying them. So the men end up having all the power. So it just, my wife will always says, women always get the short end of the stick.
Mm-hmm.
You look at transgenderism, women get the short end of the stick because men end up dominating female sports. You look at dating apps, women get the short end of the stick because they become commodities. And it's hard to argue with that, so feminists will tell us it's all about freedom of expression, right? Like now women can be just as promiscuous as men, so they're enjoying the benefits too. It's like that shouldn't be the goal. The goal shouldn't be equal, promiscuity. It should be equal security, it seems like.
Right.
But let me this might be a quick answer for you, but it is something I've wondered about, which is the Bible talks about two becoming one flesh. What does that mean? Does that mean, is it a reference to the sex act? Is it a reference to two people having a child so that both of their genetic contributions makes a child? Do you have a kind of pithy answer to that? Or is it one of those debated questions where people don't ever agree,
Yeah, I don't know that I have any great wisdom or insight on that, but I do think that it has to do with one new human life coming out of the relationship of two others, so that the two become one flesh. It's often understood as one person or one spirit, and I think that's probably that's a misreading technically, but I think there is something to that two lives are joined together, two destinies are joined together and become unified in that. But no, I don't have any deep. As soon as we end this podcast, some great insight will hit me, and I'll say, "Oh, I only wish." But
well, we'll just have to have you back on then.
That's it.
I know you mentioned this toward the beginning of the podcast about there's always the potential for creating children, and I mean we're Protestant, you're Catholic, so we might differ on this, but I'm curious if you think Christians can enjoy sex without the prospect of procreation. I mean, I can't imagine the answer is no, because at a certain age, that's no longer on the table. Are you supposed to stop having sex once a woman is, not childbearing years anymore?
Yeah. Well, Catholics say that sex has to be open to life. It doesn't mean that you actually have to achieve life. Because we know that a number of couples are open to life, but they're infertile for reasons beyond their control. So there is always the divine element in procreation. That's why we call it procreation, right? So two people can do their part, and it takes God to bless. And sometimes most of the time he does bless, but sometimes he doesn't. You may know or not that my wife and I struggled with infertility for quite a long time. So I'm speaking from experience here. It isn't that we didn't enjoy our sex relations during that time, but there was a sorrow kind of that hung over each month. My wife would, see if maybe she had conceived that month and then was disappointed. We went through that difficulty for a long time. if you have a minute, I could tell you the rest of this story. It's interesting, and really a story of God's grace for us, because it had something to do with us coming into the Catholic faith from Episcopalianism, if that's the right word. we so we couldn't conceive, and eventually we tried the in vitro fertilization. We went to the clinic and went through the intake, and we came out, and my wife said, "I can't do this," and I didn't understand why she couldn't do it. Seemed like good modern medical science, and it would solve our problem. We could have our kids, and da da da. But she couldn't do it, and so I looked into it. And the more I looked into it, the more difficulties I found for myself with this process of in vitro fertilization. And I found that the Catholic teaching on it was really right on. Was the clearest. And so we said, well, we can't do that. What are we going to do in order to conceive? Well, I had learned about this thing called natural family planning, which Catholics do, which is a way of discouraging conception, but you can also do it backwards to encourage conception. So that's what we did. We joined the natural family planning course and instantly got to know all these gung-ho young Catholic couples. And that had its own effect. And not to belabor the story, we didn't conceive through natural family planning either. We decided to adopt. That's how we got our multiracial family with 2 adopted children. We adopted one from Korea, and then later we adopted one from China. But when we adopted the one from Korea, our son, who is now 42, I think, came off of the plane. We took him home, and that night we conceived a child.
Oh my goodness!
And so we had he was 8 years old when we got him. So we had a 9-year-old and an infant 9 months later, and it's the only time we've ever conceived a child.
Wow.
We believe that God blessed us in a special way with that. So were we fertile or infertile? I would say we'd have to say fertile. We did have a child, but it's not been something that's come easily for us or common. We would have loved to have had 8 or 10 kids, but we have 3.
I will say I kind of feel like I have to say, as a Protestant, I think actually the Protestant Church has been too lax on this question of the birth control pill, et cetera, the prophylactics. I think I like the Roman Catholic Church will talk about something like what is it? It's like a prophylactic mindset or
contraceptive mindset, they call it.
A contraceptive mindset. Yeah. I agree. I think that's a problem. And when I do work with couples in like premarital counseling, I'll encourage them away from prophylactics, et cetera. So for contraceptive, if at all possible. I mean, I think there could be some defense of it if there are health issues or some other issues kind of involved. Pregnancy could be dangerous or something. But generally speaking, you should be open to life, and we should be, we should be needing, wanting to bear a good number of children. So I think that the Protestant Church does need to rethink that, and we need to, kind of start to really think about that. I will say that. And I think I'm just going to put it in my own plug here for IVF, saying we really need to rethink that. I mean, we are talking about fertilized eggs being frozen indefinitely. There was a talk, it can be found. I think Canon Press put it out. I know people don't like Canon Press, but anyway, it was a talk at Hillsdale. One of the scholars there, I think maybe it wasn't Hillsdale. Anyway, it was a talk about the Dave Rubin situation, how he and his gay partner used essentially IVF to produce children, and how gross that whole thing really was. People need to really think about that. They talked about using their sister's eggs, which would make her both the mother and the aunt to her own child. It just is not right. I think we really need to rethink that. In fact, I think I've lost a few members through the years because I couldn't get on board with IVF, and I think they wanted to have a child, and I think it was one of those deals where, I don't know. Anyway, but
You don't want to ask how the sausage is made, right? It's just
Mhm.
when you start to look into IVF, and for every viable embryo, they have to discard
Right.
uh, some fertilized embryos. Well, I think those are human beings being discarded.
Right.
Uh,
Mhm.
And meanwhile, there's a lot of children that need to be adopted and aren't. So,
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Right.
Let me ask kind of one more question here. I know we're kind of running out of time, but this is something that people actually really want an answer to, which is, all right, let's agree that you've got two people, a male and a female. They're in a marital relationship. Everything is good so far, right? All the benefits there and all that. But still, there's a kind of a question of like what is still permissible, right? Is everything on the table? And without maybe describing all the things that one ought not to do, would you be comfortable maybe kind of saying, here's kind of the boundary marker, of what, what is appropriate? There isn't agreement on this. And, sometimes couples kind of want to, I don't know what you might say, spice things up or whatever. They kind of wonder what's permissible. Pornography has had an effect on this, I think, but because people kind of think, well, let's try this thing or whatever.
Yeah, let me
Right.
throw this in the mix just to make it a little bit more spicy. I didn't tell Evan I was going to do this, but we have several people that listen to the show that are Christians. They're in a monogamous, loving Christian marriage, and they know that we're doing this series, and they've asked questions like, well, what about the stuff nobody talks about? And one of the more tame ones, like, what about pleasuring oneself apart from your spouse when you're married? Like your partner is, your partner, your husband or your wife is out of town on a business trip or something. The big M word comes up all the time when people send in questions for various events that we do. That kind of thing, I think no one ever wants to talk about. Is it quote allowed? What's that?
Monogamy? What's the
That's
M
not
word?
the one. That's not the one.
I think I know what the word is. Right.
But that's the kind of thing I think that Evan is asking about, is what are the rules? And we're not going to ask you to get too graphic here or be uncomfortable, but people are asking these questions,
Sure. Okay. Well, I think I could hang myself here, so I need to be kind of careful. I'm going to speak to you as a Catholic, and also from my own personal experience as a married man. Been married 37 years.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Very happily, we have a very mutually satisfying sex life. So, what are some boundaries? Well, one boundary, to answer your question, is that you never have sex or pleasure yourself without your partner. You always have to have sex with your partner. It is an act of love between the two of you, and to exclude one or the other from that, even with their knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Would be to make a choice to please yourself and not to please that other person.
That goes back to what you were saying earlier. Yeah.
The goal is to please that other person. And it makes, so for me, it makes my wife very special because she is my source and my only source for sexual satisfaction. And I'm her source and her only source. And that's by God's design. So it draws us always together. The problem is, if you start doing things by yourself, you might like that and you might get into that more and more. And then if they got trouble with that, then it's a step away from each other, and you don't want to take that. Now, I don't want to magnify that, the culpability of that. It's wrong, shouldn't do it. But I don't think that we should focus in real intense ways on sexual transgressions of that nature. It's just not. You won't be happy. It won't end up happy.
Not the best. Yeah.
It's not the best. So I think that in the kind of details of your sexual relations or your lovemaking, what's essential is, as I've said, that the the act that you engage in is such that it would be suitable for the procreation of a child. Now, in practical terms, that means that the man's sperm has to be transmitted to the body parts of the woman that by which she could be fertilized.
Mm-hmm.
That is that without which you cannot have legitimate, I think, licit sexual relations without that happening. So that kind of limits a lot that you can do.
Yeah, that's the
But
boundary. Yeah.
but it doesn't limit everything. So moral theologians talk about what you might do before that. A long time ago, they decided that if the woman desired to be manually stimulated so that she could better receive the man's sex organ, there was nothing wrong with that, and they encouraged that. Just so long as that's not all that happens. I think it's also, you can use your imagination and think of some that you could do. So long as you end up transmitting that semen to that presumably vagina, so that fertilization could occur, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, fertilization is up to God. Sometimes it's not going to occur. I can testify to that. Many times it didn't occur when we wanted it to. But it didn't really matter too much what we did, whether who was on top, whether it was from behind or in front, or some of these things people were. Those things I think are up to the couple, and they should do what they both find fun and satisfying.
Yeah.
So long as you don't end with something short of a godly act of copulation, I guess we'd call it. The other thing I'd say is that sex can be a place where there are conflicts of power, where one partner wants to dominate the other, and so it creates an injustice. In Catholic thinking, the problem with most sex relations outside of marriage is that they're violations of justice. They're unfair. They're unjust to somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So what we call fornication is really a sin of injustice. It's not primarily because it's sexual, but it defrauds and mistreats one of the partners, usually the woman. Homosexual relations also are unnatural and wrong in that way in Catholic thinking, but even before that, they're a violation of justice. So I think that's all I'm going to say about, in the famous words of Forrest Gump. That's all I'm going to say about that.
No, that's actually really helpful, and I appreciate you treading into dicey waters there, because so few people are willing to do that. But I think you've laid out some really beautiful boundaries that are for our best from God, right? So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I'll say too, without anyone else needing to say anything, but let me give an example. It wasn't maybe 5 years ago that I think Teen Vogue, gave young women advice on how to have anal sex. I'm just going to say it. So there's something very wrong in the sex culture when, we're telling teenagers how to do that. It's not even sort of, it's not, we're not just talking about premarital sex. We're not just talking about teenage sex. We're not just talking about promiscuous sex. We're not talking about sex involving body parts that aren't made for that, and yet have been normalized by the pornographic culture. So and you don't have to answer this, but I think that is it too much to say that let's just be blunt, certain bodily orifices, certain openings, certain cavities are better than others? The obvious one being the best, and then others being totally inappropriate.
Well, you go back to an act suitable for the
That's right.
productive life. That rules out any other bodily orifice.
Yeah.
And anal sex cannot produce human life.
Okay.
And so really not a legitimate form of sexuality. It is also much more dangerous in terms of disease and disease transmission,
Mhm.
and can be harmful. Anal sex always involves one person who dominates another. I mean, if
Oh,
you
that
think
goes back to the justice thing you were talking about,
Right.
power.
and so it's misordered in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
That's a good way to say it.
I don't think we should be harsh and judgmental toward people who are caught up in that kind of behavior, because their thinking is so twisted and the culture is so twisted, that for them it might seem good and normal. So I think we need to be gentle and caring toward
Mhm.
people who do that. And often we have a hard time, I think, doing that because it's disgusting, and we want to kind of react to that thing that's disgusting. But Aquinas says that when someone's nature is itself perverted or is defective, then the actions that they take to them seem natural,
Mhm.
seem good even. And that's the problem when St. Paul says that God turns folk over to a reprobate mind there in Romans 1. It means they can't recognize the evil that they're doing. They just don't know.
Yeah.
And Jesus said that the fact that those who were killing him didn't know what they were doing was why they should be forgiven. So I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of grace and a lot of mercy,
Yeah.
all of these topics, but that should not stop us from being utterly clear, as you've been so good and so clear, Evan, that this is not healthy human sexuality.
Yeah.
It is
And
something.
I kind of felt the need to name it because
Yep.
actually I think even in Christian marriages, because that practice has become so normalized in the pornographic culture, that I think a lot of Christian
Oh.
women don't have anyone speaking for them when they say,
Yeah.
hey, I don't want to participate in that. And the man can say, hey, we're married, everything's on the table. But
Yeah.
it is a
Yeah.
power dynamic that's going on. There's a health dynamic that's going
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
There's a lot there. And I do think that we need to start naming the thing, and start to talk about it a little bit more honestly, and maybe not from the pulpit, but in a forum like this. And by the way, like every one of these podcasts we're going to put out, even though we haven't said a naughty word and we've been very gentle how we talk about it, we're going to go ahead and put the explicit label on it. We think that way adults know, hey, don't listen to this when the kids are around. And we want to have the freedom to kind of be honest about it and talk about it.
Right.
But we're also going to have a disclaimer that says there's really not explicit content, but it's mature content, because as Christians, sometimes we need to talk about it freely. But we're just about out of time. I want to really thank you for coming on today. And there are other tangential issues that maybe are kind of more in the sociological realm or the familial realm. Like, for example, the benefits of a child having a mother and a father, which you've written extensively about. The question of gender and how, or sex really, as in, what all that means. Where can people go if they want to learn more? I found you, like I said, through the Ruth Institute. Poor Jennifer Roback Morse and you are both considered, very dangerous, controversial figures in some circles. But where can people find you in more material and those other issues that people want to explore more?
Well, most of my work is in the academic scholarly literature. So literally, if you go to PubMed or one of those academic databases and just Google my name, those topics will come up. But the Ruth Institute really is a great place to begin. They have a resource page on my work. A lot of the popularizations of it, the PowerPoint slide lectures and things like that help to explain it, even some YouTube videos that help to explain some of these things more fully. So that would be, I would say that ruthinstitute.org is probably the best place.
Gotcha. Well, good deal. Well,
Be.
say that one more time.
Dangerous as we may be.
Yeah, well, I hear you. Let's just say the critics are very politically correct these days, and you gotta you gotta be careful. You have to do discernment work as a Christian to know who's safe and who's not. But thank you so much, Dr. Sullins, for your time. Thanks to our listeners for catching out this podcast and listen to us. For Sarah, I'm Evan. We want to thank you again for listening. Check out HoustonTOT.com to learn more. And until next time, we encourage you to question freely, think deeply, and disagree as needed.